Okay, so this is the Grace and Paul Pottscast, and it's going to sound a little goofy to start with.
Because we're goofy.
Because we're goofy. We're just that goofy. So we've had lots of plans, best laid plans, and all this, and I've wanted to continue basically where we left off with the old series of recordings for the Grace and Paul Pottscast, but that hasn't, quite happened on sort of the schedule I imagined it would. We keep losing weekends and all that.
Yeah.
But I do want to lay out a couple things that I'm trying to get done here. So in the process of sort of researching this, I went back and listened to all our old conversations. And the ones that I thought were the most effective and liked the best were the ones where I didn't do all the talking.
Oh, yeah. Isn't that nice how research works?
Right. So one of my favorites and one that I put up on the feed again was when we just did a tour of our garden and hugelkultur beds and walked around, and I got you to do most of the talking, and listening back, I was barely talking for that one. I was just asking a few sort of strategic questions and comments.
Right.
There are one or two others where it was a real dialogue, but a lot of the old ones, a lot was happening. I was unemployed. I was incredibly stressed, and so an awful lot of the conversation was just me.
Kind of ranting?
Basically ranting and just nervously chattering about everything that I was worried about. And so I want to make here I am talking. I want to make a real deliberate effort, at least for a few episodes until I think we can get into a more natural dialogue, to let you do more of the talking.
Oh, great.
Please ask you to do more of the talking.
Right.
And I want you to help. If I'm rambling, not right now, because this is the introduction. But if I'm rambling a lot, just tell me.
Yeah, I can do that.
Yeah. Okay. So, we are trying an experiment in our new basement. We have a little basement studio room. The washing machine is running upstairs, and every once in a while it dumps water through the pipes and you can hear it. And I have a brief moment of panic because shortly after we installed, minutes after we installed our washing machine, the hose blew off the washer and we flooded through 2 floors of our house and wrecked 2 ceilings. We had a flood.
2017.
Yeah, so every time I hear that, and this also goes back to the old house where Pippin overflowed the bathroom as well. Every time I hear the water going down through the pipes, I flash back to that water running down through the walls and doing thousands and thousands of dollars worth of damage to our home. So Anyway, the kids are also upstairs and they're moving around and hopefully not having a fist fight. We loaned them the iPad to use to try and keep occupied. But,
silent, clean play.
Yeah, exactly. But you may hear them pounding on the door or having a fight or something. We try and pause if that happens and straighten it out. But anyway.
Here we are.
So I had asked you if you would read this book.
Yes.
And because I read it and I thought we could talk about it. That was 6 weeks ago.
Oh, yeah.
And so I have forgotten a lot of the comments and thoughts I had about the book, and I didn't make good notes. I did make some notes reviewing it in my blog, but meanwhile, you were very diligent and you made notes, and the book is full of Post-its. So why don't you talk about the book?
Okay, so this book is White Working Class, Overcoming Class Cluelessness in America by Joan C. Williams. Harvard Business Review Press. And I think I've given you a lot of information just in the title, the author, and the publisher about the book.
Maybe information they didn't intend to convey.
Right, what's that one going around now? The meme where it's the only book that poses a question and answers it in the same...
Which is...
That's what happened? Hillary Rodham Clinton.
Oh, yeah. Right.
Unintentional irony.
Yeah.
But, yes, so this is a book about the white working class.
So why don't you tell us about the author's definition of the white working class, because it's not exactly what you might expect looking at the title.
It might. It's not. It's probably not what you expect looking at the title. It's probably not what you're imagining when you talk about the white working class. First of all, she's. I think the way you described it at the time was she's renaming what most of us are referring to as the middle class as the white working class, and I have to say, I'm going to go with her on that.
Is this so? She's basically taking the whole political demographic and saying, you know what, the middle class is no longer really a thing to be reckoned with, and instead we should just divide it as working class versus the elite.
There's working class.
She doesn't talk about the poor though, so it's like she lumps the working poor.
No, she doesn't. She's actually very clear about that.
Okay.
And she goes into that in more detail, where she talks about means-tested programs, and that there is this sort of blurry line between them, where there are people on the last rungs of the working class who are very near to qualifying for benefits and don't.
Yeah, and how that actually creates class warfare.
Class warfare and really deep resentment. Well, capitalism creates class warfare, right?
Yeah, right.
But then this redirects the class warfare, right? So anyway,
I just remember feeling a little uncomfortable with her sort of eliding working class and middle class, and it even seemed like it was a little incomplete in the book, because I think she, at the direction of her publisher, she sort of changed this, maybe for marketing reasons.
Right, there's a section, I don't know if I can find it quickly, I'll try and find it before we finish, but she made an editorial decision.
She made an editorial decision.
It was an argument about how we're going to define this, how we're going to say this, and she came to an agreement with her editor.
Okay, but there are places in the book where she still refers to the middle class, I think, like she overlooked.
Kind of, maybe. I didn't see that in specific, but rather the idea that she's, the frame that she's working from is that there are people who are poor. There's the working class, which we likely commonly think of and talk about as the middle class. There's also a professional managerial elite. Yeah, she even abbreviates them as the PME at some point. And it's an interesting obfuscation, which I always think of as a lie of omission. She does not address or mention the ruling class, which is not actually identical to the professional managerial elite. Right? No. But she doesn't actually even address or discuss the ruling class because, well, she's being published by the ruling class.
So there's maybe this, a certain sort of inherent lack of truth to power built into the...
baked into the book.
Right.
Where she kind of points fingers laterally and says, this is really a vulgar way for us to treat people who are experiencing oppression, which is true. Right. But she does not actually call out their oppressors. Yeah. Which is really kind of a slap in the face, or maybe even an actual metaphorical slap in the face.
It felt so. We'll go through it in more detail, but just my overall impressions, because, like I said, I didn't take exacting notes. I did note a few passages, but the overall impression was that it was a little tone deaf in that regard. And I felt like her breakdown of the middle of the classes was a little confusing and sloppy, in part because I didn't feel I couldn't really figure out exactly where I fit, and also the way she doesn't really distinguish between cultural class and economic class, I think makes it a little bit weak for me. And just the overall feel of the book, I mean, you realize she did actually adapt this, I think, from a series of blog posts on the Harvard Business Review or whatnot. So it feels a little put together and a little rushed, maybe.
Which it was.
Yeah.
And it comes off that way.
Okay, so that's my initial critique. But yeah, please. So you've got notes and thoughts about her whole argument. So
my real critique and overarching critique of the book in its entirety is not so much with the substance of anything she says, but rather it's this problem I keep running into with people that are like, you know what, we have to stop redistributing the wealth. That's just un-American and inappropriate, and it's just wrong. It's morally wrong. And I'm like, yes, let's just be honest about where the wealth is being redistributed.
Yes. Yeah.
So, yes, you're right. We should not be redistributing the wealth. We should not be taking from the poor and giving it to the wealthy as a matter of state policy.
Right. And
it's
then,
obscene, it's wrong, it's immoral, absolutely correct.
And then there's a whole other thing about why are we even trying to distribute wealth at all rather than assets? Right.
Let's really talk about the things that are going on here.
Right.
So that's my critique of what she's saying. Is she says all this, and yes, that's all true, and it leads us somewhere, and you're being very careful not to open that door.
Yes.
About where this leads.
Right.
That's my critique of the work. But what
overall, your big picture critique.
A big picture critique.
Yeah.
But overall, I think what she says is factually true.
Yeah.
Supported by the evidence, supported by the experience, and so on. And I don't feel like this is giving a pass. I know there's a large cadre of people who feel like any analysis of the white working class and any analysis of the oppression that people face, the class-based oppression that people face, is a traitor to identity politics, or somehow a traitor betrays black people, or somehow betrays their sexism, et cetera, et cetera.
I don't think she doesn't really hide the fact that she doesn't know a whole lot about black people and and that this book really isn't about
that,
about people of color per se,
right.
No. So
or even about racism per se.
Yeah.
Right? And let me just kind of look back at my notes here.
Please.
What is it? So the first thing, and this she touches on, but this is one of the things she does not fully unpack for us, and I think she's being careful not to, is that class is both social and economic. It's primarily social. Class is primarily social.
Oh, interesting. So
right?
Can you say a little more about what you mean by that? So tell me how it works in your life.
How it works in my life?
Right.
How it works is that I cannot erase my class status no matter what I do. The color of my skin doesn't erase it. The fact that, my economic fortunes have fluctuated throughout my adult life doesn't erase it.
Right.
Really, the only place that my class status is erased is around high-income liberals. That's actually the only context where my class status gets erased, and or is ignored, or is pushed to the side. But as soon as anybody working class notes my class status, they defer to it.
Even your accent.
Even my accent, all these things, right?
And this is the thing that I feel too, and it's a little odd because I feel like my class was always confused growing up.
Right.
My parents were sort of split between working class and middle class, or upper middle class, even banker class, you know. But, just yesterday, not yesterday. Thursday or Friday, I was leaving for work, and one of our neighbors stopped me down in the driveway. And I'm driving a 2003 Honda Element and wearing a t-shirt and jeans. But he treated me like Samwise Gamgee speaks to Bilbo Baggins. You know, begging your pardon, sir. No offense, sir. No offense, sir. But
right.
And honestly, it was a little spooky.
Right.
But because we live in the bigger house at the end of the driveway, up the hill, right. We're we live in Bag End and they live in Bag Shot Row. Right. And somehow that sticks.
It sticks. You can't wash it off.
And so it doesn't matter what I'm wearing or what I'm driving or what,
Right.
So, but honestly, sometimes I can't quite figure it out. Is it like an aroma?
Was it my teeth? Well, no, sometimes it's your teeth. Sometimes it's hard to even know.
It's not my teeth, but right. yeah. For some people, it clearly is their grooming.
They're grooming,
right. That. But, I did...
You were groomed.
I did get a haircut recently, but it was the first one in 3 months. So,
right.
Anyway,
but and perhaps to use a less personal context and to use a something I think might be relatable for Americans. If you think about the landed aristocracy in Britain,
Yeah.
a lot of them are dirt poor.
Right.
They don't have any cash.
Right.
They have no cash. But they have property, they have a title, and everyone respects that.
That's the whole like PG Wodehouse thing.
But you hear in this thing, you can barely keep the heat on because,
Right.
et cetera. You're chopping your own wood to heat the damn house because you can't afford wood.
Well, that was actually us in Saginaw, honestly. We were in the big manor house.
Manor house, chopping our wood, et cetera. Because you're cash poor, but your class status exists in reality, and people respect it, and it follows you everywhere, and you can't shake it off.
Yeah.
And now I describe that for people who are in the upper class. It is every bit as true for people in the working class and poor classes. We like to, poo-poo Indians from the Indian subcontinent.
The caste system.
And describe the caste system as backwards.
That's horrible.
That's horrendous. That's backwards. It's demented.
Like treating people badly because they're, what's the term? The night soil carriers. What's there's a term for the
delete
the untouchables.
The untouchables.
Yeah.
And that's outrageous. That's unbelievable. No, we have the exact same thing.
Absolutely.
We just pretend it isn't here because we've transformed. This is my other thing that she doesn't get to, right? It's not an accident that we're unable to talk about class in the United States. Mm-hmm. Because if we can't talk about it, how can you form a consciousness about this thing you can't even discuss that apparently doesn't even exist here?
Right.
Which is a lie. It's a fundamental lie about the American society, is that class doesn't exist here.
Yep.
There are people of specific classes, and they belong there, and we have all kinds of mythology about why they belong there, and how they got there, and what happened, and whose sin was it to put them there.
And who's leaning on them to keep them bottled up there.
Right?
Yeah.
And we've got all these structures about why it's okay to lean on it to keep them there for their own good.
Right.
But all of them carefully obfuscate the nomenclature of class. Carefully obfuscate it and pretend it doesn't exist.
Give me an example of the nomenclature.
So, my old neighborhood in Hartford, Connecticut has this little situation where a bunch of PME folks bought into the 1%
professional managerial elite. Yeah.
Professional managerial elite. They're teachers. They make decent money, and I shouldn't even refer to them as PMEs, right? They're like PMEs wannabes, right? But they got together and bought one of the big houses in the nice neighborhood.
Well, you could call them wannapes.
Wannapes,
Yeah.
And they're doing this sort of co-housing commune thing, sharing space, etc. It's all very cool and hip. And then the folks in the 1% neighborhood looked around and said, "Oh, wait a minute.
Not in our backyard.
Not in our backyard. Not on our watch."
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And brought the zoning police to bear. Because you know what? They have more than 4 unrelated adults living in a house together, and that's against the law in this part of town based on zoning.
And it's nothing to do with us, it's just
it's just this is
law.
actually, it's the law.
Yeah.
This isn't us, right?
Yeah.
When, point of fact, I know those people have 3 other families living in their house as servants. Right?
Yep.
And
but that's not what the law was intended for.
No. And in fact, the law specifically skirts them and their servants who live in their houses with them to maintain these enormous houses, because it takes 4 families to do it.
Right. Yeah.
Because, they spend one night at their own home, and this is not their home address. So they don't live here.
They're not registered to vote in this.
They're not registered to vote in this district. Their children can't attend school in this district. They don't live here. They work here, even though they sleep here 6 nights a week.
Okay.
And never go home from work except for 24 hours once a week.
Yeah.
Right? But what their front story is, oh no, this is a zoning issue. We don't want this to turn into wild parties and stuff, We can't even imagine what would happen if we open the floodgates to this kind of arrangement where more than 4 unrelated adults are sharing a house. I mean, frat parties, God knows what could happen.
Right. Right.
is their frame.
They can start to organize.
They can start to organize. Anything can happen if we let this law slide. It could be absurd. When really what they're saying is we don't want people who can't afford to live here in this neighborhood, full stop.
Yeah.
And that's a class issue, and that's a class concern, and that's all that's happening.
Yep.
And point of fact, if they don't win the zoning thing, they will abandon the neighborhood rather than allow people of a different class to live there.
It was, so that reminds me, so one of the first things that our neighbor said to me was, he was somehow reassuring me. He was answering questions that I never asked, basically, reassuring me that the work he was doing on his house was only going to increase the property values in the neighborhood, and so would be good for my property value. And I'm like looking at him like, did I say anything about property values? Because the first things he asked were basically, you know, oh, you must have paid a lot for that house. And I'm like, well, we have a large mortgage. You know,
that's true.
But you know, it's a matter of public record what we paid for our house. But honestly, I don't really obsess over it. It's like a monthly bill. But you know, but for him, that distinction was hugely important, and he thought that he needed to reassure me that he wasn't going to be doing anything in the neighborhood that would affect my property value. Right,
because surely a person of your class, that would be critical to you.
And,
influence your opinion of him based on his class.
You know, if we ever do have to move and sell this house, maybe I'll be frustrated if we have a situation.
Right.
But in this county, I don't believe we will, as far as being unable to sell it.
Unable to sell. No, we could probably sell it. We'd probably take a bath, but we could probably sell it.
Sure.
Right? But that's a really key part of the distinction, at least the frame of how we talk about working class people.
Yeah.
We don't want working class people in the neighborhood. They're going to damage the property values. Have you seen the trashy way they live? They've got this trailer, you know, it's like a dumpster fire over there, over at this working class house.
That's one of the things that's kind of neat about our little neighborhood is there are people living in different circumstances.
Different circumstances, which is something I've always preferred about a neighborhood.
Personally, I like that, but yeah, I can see that if your concern was mostly economic, and you were a hateful person.
And you were an ass.
With no empathy towards people who earn less money than you do, then
yeah, that would be a concern.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So people think of themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. I think of myself as a temporarily fortunate, you know, like working class person who happens to have
fortune this time.
Who have been, you know, fortunate enough to be earning a pretty good living at the moment, you know. Anyway, so
that's actually, no, I think you're making a good point, that these are all frames about how we look at ourselves. And some of these frames, at least in the United States, have no class nomenclature.
But people make bizarre assumptions, and they assume you're thinking in one frame when you're thinking something completely different.
And all these assumptions are class-based.
Yeah. We're
just not calling it that.
Right.
Right? And then, you know, like, how could you do such a thing to bring down our property values? And, you know, make us look like working class people.
I did hear that a lot in Saginaw.
Right.
Yeah.
Because
whenever when I'd meet neighbors for the first time, those were the first words out of their mouths, where it was about their property values.
Right.
And I was puzzling, like,
what are you
really,
talking
that's
about?
your biggest worry? I'm like worried that, you know, we'll be able to feed everyone here.
For example, right?
Yeah.
But no, and these are class concerns that we have no vocabulary to express except for that.
Yeah.
Right?
And I was concerned about crime in the neighborhood, but it didn't seem like it was a serious concern despite everyone talking about it.
Being crime. Because they don't want this can't be one of those neighborhoods.
Right.
This can't be one of those neighborhoods.
No, it's true. They're concerned, their rhetoric about crime and the neighborhood watch was pretty evidently more about class concerns
than anything else.
Than actual criminality happening. You had people going into cars and stealing change from
Let's be very precise. We had adolescents who would steal change from cars when they had an opportunity.
Probably adolescents who actually lived in the neighborhood,
Right.
you know.
Which,
and you had
yeah.
things like, okay, maybe lawnmower stolen from a garage or something like that. But, you know, there weren't any like home invasions happening.
Right.
So,
Right. And in fact, the one drug dealer in the neighborhood was middle class.
Oh, yeah.
Kept his lawn mowed and neat and delightful.
right. And was running practically a dispensary out of their home.
Out of his home.
Yeah.
And was an excellent neighbor.
Right. Everyone, yeah.
The actual drug dealer.
No, he was, and you know, he was found a way to make money in a community when no one can make any money.
Yeah, so you know, there it is.
So by running a large grow operation,
basically. Yeah. So the next thing, my next note, because the thing people always come back to is, you know, the white working class is just racist. Oh my God, they're just a bunch of racists. And I will say this, they're absolutely, as a group, a bunch of bigots. But in fairness to bigots everywhere, bigotry is not unique or unusual. It's really common. Everyone is in some way a bigot about something.
Everyone has their bigotries.
Everyone has their bigotries. And so I want to be precise about what we call things.
Okay.
Usually, I'm not precise about what we call things. I don't think it actually matters if you really want to have a serious discussion and get down to what people mean. You can just keep digging and keep talking, right? But I think this impreciseness is not an accident, and it leads us to be very confused about race in the United States. There is racism, which is institutional and which is structural.
So this is where you differ, and I've heard you talk about this before in your rhetoric about racism. You say what we should call racism is structural racism. Because that's what's actually important.
Right. It's the housing department actively segregating people.
And historic redlining, and then all the fallout and consequences from those decisions.
It's the systemic funneling of people of color into the carceral state. That is racism. Okay?
And the differential policing and all that. Right.
That is the state exercising its police power and its extraordinary power to class people by race and treat them differently based on it. That's racism. Okay?
Yep.
The asshole that calls you nigger at the gas station is a bigot.
Has that ever happened to you?
Actually, no, because he knows I could sue him.
Yeah.
Right? Because again, class.
But I do, I'm not going to say that kind of open racism doesn't happen, but where I hear and see it is basically whenever a group of older white folks think they're only among friends.
Right, they're only among friends, or an older white person, usually male, but frequently female. It's really an older white person and even a younger white person who feels that their space is being invaded by black people or people of color. Like a space that they would normally go to. In other words, their safe space is being invaded.
Right.
And they're reacting strongly with racial vitriol.
Well, where I hear open racial vitriol is basically, if you're ever at a diner early in the morning where the retired or unemployed white men get together to drink coffee and eat their early bird special or whatnot. Right. That's where they just feel completely free about saying every damn thing they think.
Everything they really think.
Yeah. And
at the particular place I know you're referencing, I want to be clear that all those people are good Democrats.
Yeah, Saginaw is overwhelmingly Democratic.
Right, it's a little blue island.
Right. And those guys were probably union,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they were probably solid
blue
auto worker, union auto workers while they were working,
right. But economics ends up being a proxy for race.
Economics ends up being a proxy for race. So, because the racial disparity follows so closely. If you graph people, put people in boxes and charts and whatnot, draw the pie charts and whatever, because the same breakdown by earning matches so closely, you could just use them as proxies for each other.
And what we have in the United States is, and people are always like, why are you talking about slavery? That was so long ago. Oh my God.
A small fraction of our country's history ago.
It's most of our country's history.
Right.
It is the architecture of what we are as a nation.
Yes.
And if you don't understand that,
why are we talking?
Why are we talking? But I can't stop talking about it for you because you need to understand this.
Yes.
And what we had was there were slaves, and to be clear, there were people who were enslaved. This is not actually something inherent about their humanity. But we had enslaved people. We had white working class people, and then we had the ruling class, right? There were these three classes with some blurry lines between slaves and working class, and some blurry lines between working class and the ruling elite, where there were people who, how shall I say, their jobs were so close to the ruling elite that they crossed lines and migrated between classes some, right?
Okay.
And then we reached a point where it was, and it was actually longer ago than you might think, impolite to discuss those divisions and how they existed. We used to speak openly of them. We're not allowed to speak openly of them anymore at all, right? So, and those were social classes, right? What happened was we sort of covered that with economics, and that economics tracks closely to your social class, and your racial position in society tracks closely to your economic class.
But it's not so rude to talk about people in economic groups.
Terms. No, that's not rude.
Because it doesn't have anything to do with their identity.
Right. It doesn't do anything with their class. It doesn't actually address their class status on its face. And it doesn't have anything to do with their identity. Because, maybe they're just a temporarily embarrassed millionaire, and they'll be a millionaire next week, and these things won't be true about them anymore. Which is a lie we like to tell ourselves.
Yep.
Right?
That we're actually, if you don't know, we're actually an incredibly immobile society compared to most societies.
We are less mobile than Britain, which is like the textbook.
Yes, frozen class stratified society.
Right.
Yes.
You are less mobile here in terms of class. So what we have now is blacks still occupy that space of the enslaved. And their economic status reflects that, and their social status reflects that. And that's why it doesn't make sense to anyone to see a person with dark skin who is not a member of the underclass. It actually doesn't make sense.
This is basically why people were couldn't accept fundamentally where Obama was.
Right.
It didn't make any goddamn sense. It had to be a conspiracy.
Or some
fraud. He was not born in the U.S. There was a cabal.
There's something going on.
Something going on.
Because if you have dark skin, you're a member of the underclass.
Inherently. Right.
We don't address that on its face. That's just how we've arranged things. So we never have to actually admit that specifically, that that's what we've done. And then if you are a member of the working class, you're what people derisively refer to as white trash, et cetera, on and on and on.
Right.
Except that working class was never just white trash. It was all the farmers that owned their own land and didn't have mobility in society to do anything else.
Well, they certainly couldn't move.
They couldn't, they were really at the mercy of the economy. Right? Whereas what makes you ruling class and not ruling class is that you are not at the mercy of the economy. You run the economy.
Right.
Right? And so...
Well, to just I grew up for a time in a trailer park.
Right.
My mom bought a trailer when she moved west after my parents divorced. And there was, because my mom had a master's degree and had grown up in sort of a middle-class to upper-middle-class family, her father was a chemist and whatnot, even though I'm not going to say we were temporarily embarrassed millionaires, right? But because she was doing a job that was had a high degree of nobility and public service in it. She was a therapist, an occupational therapist working in a community mental health place. And she didn't earn very much at that. But even so, amongst the other people living in the trailer park, there were definitely class distinctions going on.
Right.
Because, like you say, she couldn't speak to someone without giving off class markers.
Right. And to be frank, they were probably outraged that she was taking advantage of all this affordable housing that someone else poor needed.
I don't remember ever hearing anything like that.
No one would say that.
But we did, we were eligible for Social Security.
Right. In numbers, economic terms.
In economic terms, and we got government cheese,
Right.
and we lived a pretty downscale existence, honestly. We were never actually hungry as far as minimal number of calories, but, we ate food that we would not have
eaten otherwise. Well,
Right.
and this is that gray area between the classes. Mm-hmm. Whereas someone has an event that damages their economic status,
Yeah.
right? And suddenly you're in this space where you're like, hey, the only way to function is like a poor person.
So we were poor,
Right.
in economic terms.
Economic terms.
And for years, it wasn't like she was about to get a better paying job,
Right.
But what put her there was the breakup, suddenly becoming a single mother,
Correct.
with one income.
So that proxy ends up catching a lot of people in the gray area, right? Where then
The economic as class.
economic as class and economic as race, right? Catches all these people in these weird gray areas. And especially in the United States, as we've kept persisting on social justice as a front game, as a put on, as something we do to be polite. Polite society doesn't embrace that kind of racism anymore, that kind of bigotry. That would be offensive.
Right. They do it through zoning.
They do it through zoning. They do it with the power of the law in these ways that are economic.
Right. It's all about economics.
Right. And then when you make it economic, you don't have to name anybody's race.
You can strip off the color,
right, and have the exact
component of it,
same
policies.
effect.
Same policies, same
policy,
outcomes.
same outcome, same effect. But now you can pretend.
But we were protecting the quality of our schools.
Yeah, we were just protecting school quality. I mean, really, we just want to protect our property values because we have a lot invested there, and it's just it's better this way.
Right.
So
those other people are more comfortable with their own kind.
Yeah, they're more comfortable with their own kind. In a neighborhood that more reflects their values and things and their culture, and more reflects their culture.
Right.
And here's the thing about it, right? I'm like I think it was Stokely Carmichael. I'm really unconcerned with someone's bigotry. I can't get worked up about someone's bigotry.
Well, it's like being angry about the air.
Right. People have their bigotry. It's there. It's part of life. It happens.
Right. I'm starting a crusade against flatulence.
Right. Yeah. Nope. So yeah, everyone's got some gas. Some of it stinks worse than others. But I'm not going to get worked up about it.
Yep.
What I'm worked up about is the structural racism that allows a bigot to act violently and get away with it every single time. Because that's structural. That's not an accident.
You're talking about the police.
I'm talking about the police state.
Yeah.
I'm talking about Dylan Roof murdering 9 black people and getting a Happy Meal on his way to jail.
Yeah, right.
Was that an act? Because,
He's just having a bad day.
Well, no, and the thing is, the state will probably execute him, to be honest, right? And the state will...
They are, yeah.
Right, and the state will... Has that already happened? Maybe I'm...
No, I don't think so.
Right, and...
But he was convicted.
And claim that this is a blow for racial justice.
He was sentenced, I believe.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is, the law working well. Except... 9 black people are dead by his hand, and he still draws air. Mm-hmm. How did that happen? How did the police not feel threatened by this young man?
You're not advocating vigilante justice at the point of...
Not in any respect.
Right.
I am not.
But you're,
I want you to consider.
Just to be clear that
How did that
it's
confess?
curious how, boy waving around a toy gun, didn't deserve a chance to even
be heard in court,
or even be looked at closely.
Well, you know what? Why didn't they take him to get a Happy Meal, but on the way to figure out what's going on?
Because he's just a kid.
He's just a kid, and maybe he was hungry. You don't know, right?
All right.
I'm just asking these questions, right?
Yeah.
Because that's the nature of racism. That's what racism is.
Mm-hmm.
It's when people routinely die at the hands of the state,
right,
and routinely die, and the state takes no action, or the action is, sort of perfunctory, right?
Pro forma,
right? That is racism.
Yeah.
Some gas bag's obnoxious rant, perhaps even at me in public, and frankly, I'm not unaware that this happens, that people will attack you with vicious things on Twitter and social media. And
this is a whole new, there's a whole new subgenre on YouTube of white people melting down in public, right? Publicly ranting to someone of color or who they think is of color, or
something, right?
In which suddenly, we're
right. Well, and that's actually the place where I've experienced the most sort of racist vitriol was actually in public school in a predominantly white community where they felt like I was invading their space. Right?
Did that happen to you?
Oh yeah, no, we moved to, that was part of it was
I don't really know that history.
Was our white flight basically from the city in the 80s?
Your white flight.
Our white flight.
Yeah, the black family.
Right, our
that engaged in some white flight.
That our black neighborhood started getting dangerous. And this was, to be clear, this is the neighborhood that had redlined Jews and blacks were redlined into in Hartford, right? One of the Jewish hospital, the synagogue was in this neighborhood. So for a long time, Jews and blacks had been relegated to this neighborhood. But after the point where Jews started to identify as white,
so they had been allies.
And we lived in the same neighborhood.
Right.
But there came a point where Jews,
and your family in particular, that made a lot of sense, given that you were black and Jewish.
Right. So when we lived there in the 70s and early 80s, it was past the point where American Jews had started to identify as white people and to pass as white and moved into white neighborhoods and so on. And these neighborhoods became more black and Hispanic and immigrant neighborhoods. And it wasn't so much immigrants yet, but it was really a very sort of a poor black neighborhood is what it was evolving to. And it became, there was actual violence in school, actual violence in the neighborhood and so on. And at that point, to my father's chagrin and my mother, joy.
They decided they couldn't sustain this experiment anymore.
No, and moved to the suburbs, like all the other white people in the city.
Right.
They, in various ethnic groups, they moved to the burbs. And for us, that meant us going to really not a non-integrated school, a segregated white school for us as children. Whereas my brothers had gone to a mostly black and somewhat diverse public school in Hartford. And just to illustrate...
But it must have been a good school, right? They all went on to educational
it was a great school.
attainment.
Yeah, it was a good school. They all went on to great things.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was in that context where I experienced a lot of racial vitriol from my classmates. Right? Who, couldn't comprehend how or why I was allowed to be there because I was from the wrong class.
Allowed to be there.
Right.
Yeah.
How are you allowed to be here? You're from the class of brown people. They don't go here. Which is...
You've never told me. I've never heard you talk about this.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's... I don't know. That wasn't the big deal. It didn't
It didn't seem like a big deal to you.
Well, yeah. I mean, it was hurtful, right?
But it does... I mean, in retrospect...
it's not a big deal.
It was water's wet.
Water's wet. No one ever laid a hand on me.
Yeah.
And frankly, whenever push came to shove, and people had to talk to my father and my mother, it was all very, yes, governor. Sorry about that, sir.
Yeah.
And appropriate people were punished. So for my experience, yes, those working class white kids got to say all their nasty things.
But it didn't have, I mean,
right.
It wasn't a consequence in the way that
Showing up dead one day as a consequence.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Right. And those things are very different.
It wasn't like you looked a cop in the eye.
It wasn't, something like that, some horrible transgression like that.
Not a Philando Castile kind of situation.
Right. Nothing like that.
Yeah.
So,
sorry,
I'm trying to find where I was. Oh, yes. So the funny thing about this obfuscation, because we start talking about this obfuscation of social class and race into economics, is it allows us to continue state-sponsored bigotry. It allows us to continue racism. We can go full throttle with the racism as a state. At the same time that we denounce and get apoplectic, frankly, we get apoplectic about an individual's personal bigotry.
Because we're just supporting the very successful economic status quo.
Right, that's all we're doing.
And the economic
we can
things
pretend
that
that's not
have
racist.
Worked well for the ruling class. Yeah.
And frankly, for those of you who are at the blur line between the working class and the ruling class, which is what she's referring to as the professional manager.
PME, yeah.
Those people are at the blur line.
Right.
And it works well for them when things work for the ruling class.
Yep.
They're deeply invested in things working out for the ruling class. And so they cannot address state bigotry. They can't, or state racism. They can't address that. They can't even countenance its existence. But the guy that says nigger, well, he's going to have to pay.
He's got to go.
He's got to go.
Yeah.
That's a situation. And let's talk about that ad nauseum.
Yeah.
Right? And that's its function. It's supposed to work that way. We're supposed to talk about your individual bigotry ad nauseum and never, ever address, notice, or even glance at state racism.
State racism and class.
And class. We're not even supposed to notice it.
Right.
We're supposed to talk about the bigotry. And this actually was a very interesting piece. Or did you read about what's her name? I can't pronounce her name. Iljamo. She interviewed Rachel Dolezal. She's a black activist that's popular now.
Rachel Dolezal, she was the woman who not
Rachel Dolezal. She's the name I can remember. The black woman, of course, doesn't get much screen time, so I can't even remember her name. It's Ijamo.
I'm sorry,
Oleo. I'm mispronouncing her name.
Okay.
Yeah, how sad is that, right? But she was posting about her fear in a Cracker Barrel.
Oh, yeah,
right?
I did see that. I did not read that. Sorry.
Right.
I so many things go by on Facebook.
But again, this was about her fear that she could be attacked and the state would do nothing. She was not safe here.
I think you don't think she was maybe taking the name just a little too on the nose?
Maybe so, except that's what you find when you go on a Cracker Barrel, right?
Yeah, well,
right?
That is true.
And so people pounced on her with all this BS about reverse racism, right?
Yeah, that's not a thing.
That's not a thing, right?
So.
But she had some very legitimate bigotry. She had some very legitimate prejudices about what to expect.
Prejudices.
And they're entirely legitimate.
No, it's just you can't. People in situations where they literally their lives could be in danger and whatnot,
right.
They cannot afford to. Well, let's try and be open-minded.
Let's be open-minded. No, she can't be open-minded.
Let's not assume the worst possible scenario.
No, that's really what she needs to
maybe
do.
This time when the cop shows up, he'll be officer friendly and treat me respectfully. Well,
right.
You can't assume that.
Maybe this time when the officer shows up, he'll prosecute the people who attacked me.
Yeah.
And not shoot me.
It's too risky.
It's absurd.
Yeah.
It's absurd. And I think if we can't accept that people have legitimate prejudices for whatever reason, maybe they're imaginary.
Yeah.
A lot of times they're not. Most of the time, it's just not imaginary.
Right.
When you have a prejudicial expectation of the people that are around you.
Well, that's what Gavin Becker says, right?
Right.
There's a book called The Gift of Fear that we read, which basically he's a security specialist and he works, he investigates. He did security for celebrities who were being stalked and whatnot, and he talks at length. Basically, to boil the book down, it's that we have evolved millions of years of reflexes of like intuition
Right.
about people's motives.
Right.
And most of us are really good
at it.
At recognizing when someone is
Means
sketchy.
harm.
Yeah, means
Someone means
you
harm.
harm.
You
No
know.
matter what they're actually saying or doing or offering, there's something skeevy or sketchy or whatnot oozing from their pores, and that you should honor those things. And he cites a lot of cases where someone talked themselves out of the fact that they were terrified of this creepy guy and wound up dead or raped or
harmed in some irreparable way.
Yeah, yeah.
So when she walks into her Cracker Barrel, it's like, hey, looks like it could be dangerous for me in here.
Yeah.
She's not wrong.
No.
And even if you feel that you can describe that as prejudiced,
sure,
she's not wrong.
Yeah.
And so, and that's the frame that allows her to not be wrong, to have her prejudices. When we understand that racism is something the state does, and prejudice and bigotry is something that we develop based on our experiences. And at least for us, it's real.
Our experiences and the stories we grow up with.
And the stories we grow up with.
Yeah.
And at least for us, in our context, it's real.
Yep.
And this is not to say she's a bad person or that she handled that wrong, to simply describe that her prejudices are legitimate. I don't think I'm mistreating anything she said or victim blaming to say that she's right to be concerned about her safety as a black woman surrounded by white people in the United States.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of Sandra Bland, right?
Right. That's not imaginary.
No.
Right? She's not imagining that.
No, I don't think she is.
Now, the other thing,
even if no one is actually planning to act on their bigotry, on their skeevy views or fantasies or whatever
they've got going on.
Even if no one is planning to that, it's just the way. I mean, I don't want to derail us any more than we're already derailed, but that's where I see bigotry towards us as a couple.
Really, what's that?
Is in people's facial expressions.
Oh, right. They're kind of like repulsive.
When they glance at us in a restaurant. Right. That's where I see it. I never hear it.
No. Well, it would be rude to say something like that, Paul.
But I do see it in their faces. And it's often very shut down. They become poker-faced.
Right.
But their first, unguarded reaction of revulsion on their faces is there to read. It's there to see.
It's there plain to see.
And you see it.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So,
but it's kind of what someone asked me why wasn't I more vocal about sexism and racism? I was like, because I wouldn't do anything else.
You do nothing but scream at people.
I would do nothing but scream at people 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I wouldn't sleep. I wouldn't go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
That's all I would do.
All right. We're trying to review a book and talk about it.
Yeah, in case you're wondering what the hell's happening here. We're reviewing a book.
Grace and I are in the middle of a conversation that's gone on so far for about 16, 17 years. Really. Right. So but let's
get back to...
You've got some notes and you've got some points and I want to
But this larger point that we're unfleshing or fleshing out rather, unpacking, is how this business of obfuscating class and race with economics, and then shouting about bigotry, because now we get to shout down this woman for being a bigot, for being prejudiced about what might happen to her in this environment. Like we give voice to that lie, that we get to shout down bigotry. No, bigotry is beside the point. What the point is, state racism. That's the point. That's the problem. That's the thing.
Yeah.
And we can pretend it's not there because, no one said anything bigoted. Right. We can't tell if that was a hate crime.
We just got this form back in the mail and our application was refused.
Yeah. Hard to say what happened. Sexism, by the way, functions on very much the same terms, in very much the same way. That you can make policy that affects women without ever mentioning women because you're making policy based on economics.
Well, certainly, it has nothing to do with the fact that they're women, that need paternity leave,
Yeah.
and that 1 week a month they're just not competent employees.
Right. It has nothing to do with women.
Has nothing to do with their gender.
No.
It's
Because
just
that
a
would be
fact.
wrong. That's just a fact.
Yeah, and
It's just an economic thing.
it's an economic decision.
Right. But it functions in that same way where you can pass the most sexist, vulgar policy based on economics and then say, oh, he called you a slut. That bastard. He can't work here anymore.
Right.
At the same time,
Right.
you deny all manner and kind of accommodation to women in the workplace, to just women in the world.
Right.
Right? At the same time. But he did what? Oh.
What he must hate women.
He must hate women.
Yeah.
And this is what I think is this I think is an undersung part of her book that I think people may not even noticed. Is she talks about and unpacks how working class men actually help and support their wives. They actually do childcare. They actually care for the house. They actually support their wives in their careers.
But she also talks about how working class men aren't willing to take pink collar jobs, even though there may be pink collar jobs in their neighborhood.
Maybe. Except they are. All the working class white men white boys that I went to school with are nurses today.
Are nurses.
Right.
So, okay, but she does talk about pink collar jobs and this discomfort about...
They have a discomfort to take it.
Well, this is part of the anger and the frustration of the white working class male, is that they've had to give up some of their masculine identity or
while PME or professional managerial elite men maintain theirs. They maintain their masculine status, while working class men have to do things that are traditionally reserved for women.
Uh-huh.
And how embarrassing is that?
Mm-hmm. And this is part of their
sort of like...
their Trumpism.
Their Trumpism, their
voting
festering
with their
rage.
middle finger.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, screw you. And I'll get back to the sort of response of like, how can they vote against their interests? Oh my God, what a moron! How you know,
well, yeah, she
whatever.
talks a lot about that.
Yada yada yada. She talks a lot about that, but I again, she doesn't go far enough.
Mm-hmm.
She's well reined in, but well penned in what she's allowed to say. But this larger thing of a lot of professional managerial elite folks are stay-at-home moms. In fact, they're the only people who are left can be stay-at-home moms largely. And it's a mark of pride in a working class community that your wife can continue to stay home.
Yes.
But if your wife works, she is supported in her career. You do a lot of the housework. You do all these things. That actually happens in working class households, that men and women are sharing the tasks of the household.
It happens more in working class
households. It happens a lot more. Whereas it ends up being deferred to as, no one calls it women's work.
Right.
But it ends up being relegated to women's work that is either paid. If it's paid, you're paying someone who's not your wife to do it, a woman who's not your wife to do it. Or it's something she manages. That's all her job, and you know nothing about it and care nothing about that.
Someone in terms of a nanny or a household help or something.
Some household help or something.
Yeah.
And so this sort of sexism in structure and in the structure of society persists, even though the work on the ground to actually overturn these social expectations of women is actually being undertaken by working class men.
They're more, in that sense, the working class, as she describes, are much more progressive.
Much more progressive. In practice, even though they say bigoted, sexist things.
Yeah.
They show up and change diapers.
Well, I've heard this said of black fathers, too. I know there's a crisis in black fatherhood,
Except there isn't, but yeah.
But that black fathers, when they're not incarcerated, are much more engaged.
Much more engaged parents, right?
And I always personally feel frustrated by sort of the limits to the engagement that I can do given
with your children,
my work hours and our
etc.
Yeah,
and that's always the deflection of and I shouldn't call it a deflection or an excuse, but that's what it keeps coming up as amongst PME men. Is I've got my job and I've got to keep this job.
I've got to keep this job.
Right?
Yeah.
And that, again, is the economic structure enforcing patriarchy.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I'm sure also there are ways in which I could push back against those priorities given my relatively privileged status, but I've spent my whole career not pushing back too hard on them because jobs have been fragile.
Yes, they are. And that's the nature of
they
it.
collapse on their own so oftentimes, no matter how hard I work. I don't want to give them a push.
Give them a push.
Right.
Right? And those are all these individual decisions we make.
Yeah.
That add up collectively. And I think the truth of what she's saying about lived reality on the ground can't actually even afford to be sexist. Right?
Yeah, there's something to that. Yeah.
But it keeps being reinforced from without by the structures we live in, which are designed and maintained with the really ardent support of this PME group and the ruling class.
You're talking about women's wages as well.
Women's wages, maternity leave, the very nature of work and how it happens.
Mm-hmm.
Right. All these things. And I, not to go too far afield, because she doesn't actually even address this in the book. It's one of my hobby horses.
Yeah.
The really widespread, almost shocking feminization of poverty happened. It correlates with no-fault divorce in a remarkable way. We'll unpack that some other time.
Okay. Yeah, that's probably a little afield for today's discussion.
But then again, that was a ruling class decision.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
For men to, it was like Henry VIII, for men to be able to get out of.
Let me be free of that.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And so, again, this sexism thing, this charge of sexism against the working class, they're sexist. They say all kinds of horrible things.
Mm-hmm.
But let's take a look at what they do. And let's take a look at the way society is structured for sexism. And let's talk about that, because that's the thing that matters.
Mm-hmm.
Not someone's personal bigotry. I mean, it might smell bad. It might be offensive to you. But the thing that matters are the social structures that enable it and encourage it and enforce it as a demand.
Perpetuate
it as a demand.
Whereas you could wake up the next day a completely unprejudiced person, but your actions that you take in the structure that exists, in the organizations that exist, following the laws that exist, and all this, it keeps going.
It keeps going. Well, no, and lots of people, you can hear story after story about someone's personal experience where their personal bigotry and prejudices were transformed. How wonderful would it be if she went into a Cracker Barrel and a white person behaved like a decent human being and treated her with dignity? How wonderful would that be, right? And maybe that might change her prejudices. How wonderful would it be if people have experiences that change or give dimension and features to their prejudices and their personal bigotries?
People become three-dimensional for them who were previously two-dimensional.
That's great. I like it when that happens. But if that never happens, the state racism still has to stop.
Sure.
We can't rely on those personal experiences to transform state racism because they can't.
Right.
They have no power to do so.
Right. To move men's hearts or whatever.
Yeah, whatever. Please. Because it's not like we're changing these structures with how we vote. We can't change these structures with how we vote.
No, it's baked in.
Yeah. So really, this brings me to my conclusion, which admittedly I had before I read the book, and which I think she supports well and is very careful to stop short of really grabbing by the horns.
Uh-huh.
We have to stop letting our class prejudices against working class people become the locus of our conversation. And the locus of our conversation needs to be, number one, revealing class consciousness, because it exists. And then, number two, dismantling the state racism and the state policy that is so vitriolic and oppressive to so many people.
Are you talking about, in part, she describes this situation where she's meeting her husband's classmate at a family high school reunion.
Oh, that was I think very illustrative, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're your analysis of the book so far is kind of deeply into the theoretical, but we're not talking that much about
the book,
the structure and
yeah,
and her argument.
This is a very NYRB review, just to be clear. We're not actually going to talk about the book. We're just going to take it as a jumping off point.
Yeah, well, that's what I love about the NYRB, but people might like to know that the book actually does have a lot of anecdotes and examples. And this anecdote, I found it very interesting because it left me puzzled as to what the right thing to do is. Mm-hmm. She meets a guy at her husband's high school reunion, I think, and yeah. she describes a class distinction between her and her husband, which is interesting.
Actually, it's her husband who says it to this guy, this old classmate. So what do you do?
What do you do? And this guy, as she puts it, he actually is enraged immediately and like hisses, "I sell toilets," and so
because what he has to do to survive is humiliating.
What he has to do to survive is humiliating, and that's not his identity.
It's not his identity, and it really feels like his friend came back from the big city to rub his face in it.
But a PME person, including me, although I'm not necessarily quite down with her description I don't identify entirely as a professional managerial elite. I've kind of actually tried to stay distant from that class in some ways.
It's a bit fuzzy.
But I do identify with what I do. I'm a software engineer, and I've done it for 40 years, and I'm good at it. And when you describe software engineer, it actually does fit a lot of things about me. Right. That I'm analytical, problem solving, go very in depth in topics that to most people are pretty far down the rabbit hole. Right. That's who I am.
Right.
So.
Whereas that's not even what you have to do to survive when you're not in the PME.
Right.
It'll kill you if you
identify with it.
Yeah.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I believe personally in the dignity of work of any kind.
Certainly. But no one's permitted that.
When I've done jobs, in college, I worked summers, nights as a janitor. Right. And I don't regret that. And I thought it was actually kind of educational.
But would you retake that job to feed your children and go there every day for the rest of your life at this point in your life?
I do think about this because at some point, I'm about to be 50. Mm-hmm. At some point, age discrimination in my field may just become so intense that I can't get that next job. Mm-hmm. The problem is that the difference between a 6-figure income to feed a family of 8 and keep our home versus what I could earn as a janitor is so enormous that that I don't know that I could do it. There are lots of, when I was unemployed a few years ago, there were lots of types of work that I would have been willing to do if I could have figured out any way to make it work as far as not losing our home.
Right. And I think that's the thing a lot of these folks are experiencing is they've figured out how to have a home and feed their kids. Sometimes a lot of them, not that often.
Selling toilets,
scrubbing floors, etc.
Right.
And the depredations they are at the mercy of,
right,
are unspeakable. And as soon as we start to unpack
3 jobs, or whatever you have to do, never sleeping,
and to unpack
husbands and wives in opposite shifts, and
right. Well, not even that. Just the way you are now at the mercy of so many things.
There's a book that's on my pile to read shortly about evictions.
Right,
and that's a very troubling story. Right. But it's a reality for a lot of people. Yeah.
And so when you have people who have this profound mistrust of the government and institutions, that mistrust is being bred in their day-to-day lives, right? Because of the experiences they have and how on the edge they are in everything they do.
Well, it's certainly not going to breed a great appreciation of the rentier class,
No,
or the
not
landlord class,
right?
you know.
And to someone who's a member of that class or exists at the pleasure of that class, it seems completely incoherent. Like what? This is completely incoherent. Doesn't even make sense, right? But you know what's funny about this is the reason the PME is losing their minds about Trump.
Yeah.
Not because his policy is fundamentally different than anything that's come before.
What he was actually getting passed.
Right, what he's actually getting passed. But all the things he's talking about, that if he actually does some of these things, even at all, some of their jobs are in question now.
Yes.
So the depredations that working class people have faced for decades, the depredations that Black Americans as a class have experienced since the inception of the country, are now at their doorstep. And that is a horror. They know this is horrendous, but it's fine as long as we're talking about those bigoted working class people. And it's fine as long as we're talking about this group that ostensibly doesn't even exist in the United States, of an underclass.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because we have all these programs for them. We have all these poverty programs for that underclass. And we're so virtuous for having those. And how can we let those things go under the bus? I mean, they're really important. Which, by the way, it's the very existence of the means testing for those programs at the line between the working class and the underclass.
That means testing defines the classes.
Defines the classes, right? And when you're on the line, and when you're in the working class, you are painfully aware that it's
So
just...
you're under the bus and not driving the bus.
You're under the bus, not driving the bus. And it's the dollars you have to get on the bus maybe and afford a ticket on the bus that keeps you out from under it. And that's it. The only thing keeping you out from under the bus is your ability to pay the fare.
But what that left me with, that anecdote, was she then went on from there to talk about, okay, well, if you are not of this class and you don't have the right signifiers and whatnot, and you do want to express your solidarity, you do want to, or just have a conversation, how do you do it? And that left me as frustrated as ever, because she was saying, well, why don't you learn about sports, Well,
no, but that's one of my problems with this. This is where she's going into the weeds and not getting at the heart of the matter.
Right.
We don't need to discuss sports with each other.
Right.
We just don't. That's not important.
But no, I hear this all the time that, well, you need to learn how to appreciate the culture of working class people or people who are different than you, so you have something to talk about, Right. And I do, I find things, we had an assembler, a guy working in our office who was assembling hardware, which was an hourly position, and he was a Black man of a different class. We actually did find something to bond over a bit, which was he likes some of the same weird music that I like. And so we talked about mushroom jazz and acid jazz, and I brought him in a couple CDs to listen to, and he's like, this is freaky, here, listen to this, so we got along in that way. But let's say this is made real in a big way for me, in that the people who bullied me 40 years ago, 30 years ago in high school are now my friends on Facebook. It's hard to reading their posts and reading what they talk about. I've never yet been to a high school reunion, and it's coming up. It's going to be, the next one is going to be 35 years. 35 years. Yeah. And let's say I decided, well, first of all, I've got to ask myself, why would I want to go back? Right. But let's say I decide that, I really do want to meet some of the people that I knew who weren't all awful, but some of them I considered friends back then. They're going to show up this year. I'd really like to go back and meet them and talk to them. Right. What the hell do we have to talk about?
It's a good question. For my part, if you're not talking about the revolution, you're not talking.
That's so. Why would I start watching football so that I have something to say?
I mean, ostensibly, if these people are your friends or were your friends, there were things that you talked about then. You can revisit that territory, right? But again, we're getting into the weeds
pretty,
here.
We're going to talk about bands we were listening to 35 years ago.
Maybe so. It's nice to reminisce.
I suppose.
But at the same time...
Reminiscing would be. But it quickly devolves into so do you still listen to the Styx? And
well, sure, right?
Yeah, right.
And we did go to my high school reunion one year,
yeah.
right?
How did that go for you?
Oh, it was fine. I reminisced. I got to see people I hadn't seen.
Yeah. I think you had a lot more positive memories of high school.
Oh, I did.
And
I
connections did. than I did.
Right. And that was along with a heavy serving of racist vitriol. Right. I had all these positive experiences.
Yeah.
Alongside that, so I saw them. They're doing well. I don't feel like I need to go back every 5 years.
The people who are my closest friends, who actually we're not very close, from that age, they're now full-on global warming deniers. They're now full-on Trump supporters. They're full-on amateur Bible scholars too. And
Amen.
An awful lot of their Facebook posts are weird religious articles and justifications for why Trump is fulfilling the Lord's work, the prophecies, or what. And it's really
a little bizarre.
It's really head scratching stuff. Their theology is psychotic.
But you know what? I submit that we use the mental health term psychotic.
Okay, sorry.
Too much, right? But
it's impossible for me to understand, or nearly so.
But it's what we're looking at is inchoate to us because of our perspective.
Yeah.
And that people really do make reasonable decisions based on what's actually going on around them in their lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
That happens. It happens over and over and over again. And even as young as 5 years old, you're making reasonable decisions about what you see happening around you and what you think you want to have happen as a result, right?
Okay.
And that's just true. We can't just kind of otherize people of any class or any race or any group by saying, well, they're just, whatever, fill in the blank. And when we do that, largely when we do that, we're getting away, we're taking our eyes off the ball, which is addressing the oppression of the state.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So while we're standing there talking about football, we're not...
Right.
We're not talking about what's really going on.
But so let's say I'm going to try to talk politics with them. And let's try and take apart one thing they're discussing and talk about it. I had one guy who used to bully me, actually threw my bike off a bridge in high school, right? Yeah. And everything I said, I'd cite some sources, like here's an article. And he would take the source and feed it into a website, which he uses apparently to give that site a rating. And it wasn't a rating as to whether it was trustworthy or not trustworthy. It was a rating as to whether it was liberal or conservative, where it stood on the spectrum of liberal and conservative.
Right.
And so when I'd cite a source, even if it was a Pew Trust or something, he'd put it in there and say, sorry, it's a liberal source. I can't accept this. And I was just really scratching my head. So, I mean, I get that he doesn't want to read anything in the New York Times. I don't really want to read anything in the New York Times anyway, for different reasons. But okay, I really left me puzzled. Like, do we have any shared facts anymore?
No, it's a very dangerous place.
It's very dangerous.
We haven't had shared facts for 15 years.
And so
the
level of, just to look at one, of my pet issues of global warming denialism, right? Mm-hmm. It's a joke to them. The idea that you're not serious. You can't actually believe in this hoax, right?
Hoax.
It's ridiculous.
Right.
Like, where do you go from there?
Right. Well, first of all, I got kind of in the weeds on this discussion about the white working class and empathy for them back around the election.
Yeah.
And the thing that people keep coming back to is, so I'm supposed to hang out with white racists now? What? and no. Yes. Except, let's back up and talk about the words we're using.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, everyone you hang out with is prejudiced or bigoted in some way.
In some way.
So let's just put that aside. You're supposed to engage your relationships with people as relationships.
Well, especially since this often splits families now.
Right.
Like Thanksgiving
You can't have
meals.
dinner
I can hardly imagine going home to Thanksgiving. No, we don't do that anymore.
No. We never did much. To be honest
because our family isn't living mostly. But I mean, if they were,
what even?
I mean, the Drift Class of the Professional Left podcast describes this as going home to see crazy Uncle Liberty, right?
Etc. Right?
Yeah.
And so, but you have to engage this on a relationship level.
Yes.
Right? Because for my part, that's the reason I want to overturn the power of the state, because I don't want to hurt the people I care about.
And hurt your relationships.
And hurt these relationships, right? That's what, and like, what is it, Che? The revolutionary is motivated by love.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, right? Yeah. So when we're really talking about these folks with whom you went to high school, these folks that look like just, unbelievable bigots, or whatever you are imagining you see when you see this person.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not talking about some fictional stand-in for person. I'm talking for that actual specific person that you know.
Right.
Right? What is your relationship with that person?
Mm-hmm.
And you're the only person that can answer that, right? There are a number of people with whom, I actually have no relationship with them. And their bigotry wasn't a big deal for me anyway, but I'm certainly not going to go looking for it. You're
not going to make a special effort to have a dialogue.
To have a dialogue or to deal with them or anything.
There's nothing at stake for you.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, not at all, right? But for the people with whom I have a relationship of some kind.
Well, there are.
That's where I have to start.
There are some of those.
Right.
But we can't talk because when I talk about who I am and what I believe and what I'm thinking now, it's just.
Well, no, that's the thing. You can't go to the revolution day one, right? And I'm using the word revolution. I consider myself much more radical than revolutionary personally.
Yeah.
But that's another conversation for another day.
Yeah.
You can't talk about those things day one or even day 10 or year 10. And it necessarily, if you need to talk about the revolution in every conversation, you've got a problem, right?
But that gets us back to, if you're a revolutionary and you don't know anything about sports, what do you do, right?
What
do you do?
But you
and you're not allowed to say, so what do you do?
No, you talk to the person about the things. I'm thinking of the women that I went to high school with that I still know and love and think they're so wonderful. We share things in common. Some of us love the same books.
Mm-hmm.
Some of us love the same...
Yeah, that's not happening with my high school class.
Right. So some of us just love...
That's funny.
Love our kids, love the lives that we've made for ourselves, etc.
Yeah.
And don't have a lot of political shared ground.
Right.
But I tell you what has happened for so many women and men that I've known for ages and ages is as our conversation has developed, as our relationship has developed and matured, and they know me more and deeper and better,
mm-hmm.
they say, so what do you think about...
They start to ask you your opinion.
What do you think?
Yeah.
And
then maybe there's a teachable moment.
Or maybe they have something to bring to the table for me.
Maybe you can learn something.
That I didn't know before.
I mean, I do find this happens sometimes. And one thing that's actually a pretty reliable thing that I fall back on, that actually is fun for me, mm-hmm. with people outside my class and culture and all that, is I love to talk about food.
Yeah.
And cooking and eating and,
Always a good starting point.
And yeah, for many people. I mean, some people are just like, well, if it's not Domino's Pizza or a cheeseburger from McDonald's, I don't understand it.
Well, no, and that's okay too, right? You walk in. What I'm talking about here is not that you're going to go and have these random conversations with sort of like cut out people that don't actually exist. But number one, they're people you're in a relationship with. Maintain those relationships on healthy terms, right?
Yeah.
But number two, maybe you're in a social setting.
It's pretty hard to maintain a relationship on a healthy term when everything around you is deeply diseased.
Well, certainly. Yeah. But then there are these middle grounds. I mean, I'm talking about those spaces where I'm not talking about anybody going anywhere and getting to know bigots that they don't want to know.
Mm-hmm.
Right? what I'm talking about is, number one, your actual relationships need to be healthy and need to be maintained. And then number two, there's this middle ground where you might go to a reunion, you might go to a party or some such thing where you're confronted with people you don't know.
This is just, it's also just
And
like
I'm almost done.
Oh, sorry.
And you have to introduce yourself, and you have to negotiate that introductory space. You can just say, "So what's good over here on the buffet table?
Uh-huh.
Why do you like that? How you doing today?"
I was thinking a little bit while you were saying it about third places.
Yeah, yeah.
And also the loss of shared public space.
Yeah.
Like non-profit shared public space. Not the food court at the mall.
Nope.
No.
Nope.
That doesn't count. But some kind of shared public space. And we did see that sometimes in Saginaw because there was a real effort by the city to have like celebrations, square stuff going on.
Right.
I mean, it can't also just be, oh, look, we bought all these fiberglass fish and everyone gets to paint a fiberglass fish. Right.
Although we had our bunnies, that was true.
Our bunnies. But I mean, that's not really sufficient.
That's not what we're talking about.
But we're talking about, everybody gets together to watch the fireworks display.
Right. Which, frankly, is kind of amazing in Saginaw.
My dad was blown away that we were like practically under the shelves. You know?
No, it's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
And so those losses are real. Yeah. But they've happened, right? It's happened. We don't have shared facts anymore.
Mm-hmm.
That's gone. It's gone. And what we do have left are the relationships with each other. And what we do have left are occasional interactions with people that we're not, it's a work environment. It's this environment where you're required on some level to be there, and you have to be a decent person. You can't be a dick here. Okay. You also can't advance.
That's like the definition of an office environment, though. This is your safe place to be a dick for a lot of office environments.
Yeah. Right.
But yeah.
So in those spaces, yeah, sure. There's some neutral way to encounter people. Food's a good way, right? What was your last, outing? What did you do in your last outing, kind of thing? And that gets very touchy because in some groups and some classes it was a barbecue.
Oh,
some
I
groups and some
was
classes
in the
it was
Hamptons.
hunting. Some groups it was the Hamptons, etc.
Yeah.
And so on. And that can be very touchy. But for a lot of people, like, so what'd you do this summer?
Yeah.
Right? Because they have summer vacation, the kids go to
now
school.
I'd be saying I worked all summer.
I worked all summer. Didn't get but
right.
But then now you've got an opening.
Right. Maybe you can sympathize over how you never get enough time off.
You never get enough time off. Maybe that's shared. Maybe it's not. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. But there are all these things that you can talk about that aren't the identity politics of someone's job.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm. But you're right. Yeah. You have to have, that's what I come down to is, do I have a reason to talk to this person anymore?
What's my reason to even talk to this person?
I never liked this person to begin with.
Right. So why are you talking now?
Well, because that's something weird that Facebook has brought about.
Yeah. No, I don't buy it. No, not. I don't buy into it. Rather.
Yeah.
Yeah. If we don't have a reason to talk, I don't talk.
If we don't know each other and think well of each other to begin with, why would we suddenly be arguing on Facebook? Yeah. Right. I got to police myself more about that. People I haven't spoken to in 20 years suddenly like, oh, hi, buddy. Like, not your buddy.
Not your buddy. Do I know you?
Anyway.
Well, no, and people will show up and they're ready to argue, and I just don't engage them. Because, I'm not really here to argue and defend the humanity of human beings.
One thing I have to remind myself of is that if a person's spouting off on their own page saying something angry and offensive,
that's their space to do it.
It's their space to do it, and it shows up in my feed, and so I see it as like a rant directed at me.
Not you.
But that's a function of Facebook.
Yes,
that's a function of the algorithm that puts stuff on your feed.
Right.
And actually, it's showing me stuff on that person's feed because in the past I've argued with that person.
Right. Well, and this is what
and
gets
it keeps
me,
you on Facebook, so you look at more ads and they collect more information about you.
Yes. Right. No, I have this thing where I just kind of say what I think and don't really engage in argument per se, largely. Right?
Yeah.
Occasionally,
yeah.
I think something is too...
I certainly do it a lot less than I used to.
Something is too much of a personal attack.
Yeah.
That I've just got to say, we're not going there.
I'm going to shut down.
We're not going there, right? But otherwise, I just don't really engage with that. And my radicalness is a little bit offensive to people. Okay, so it's very offensive to a lot of people.
Right, right.
And they usually just don't follow me. They just go away.
Yeah.
Like, oh, that nut job. Yeah, I used to know her at church, and she's just gotten crazy.
Yeah, no, you've been the same.
I've been like this for decades.
People that I know from high school will occasionally say something to me like, I thought I knew you. Back in high school, you were such an ordinary guy. And I'm like, you know what? I was the guy that submitted a paper about the history of the Fabian Society, the Fabian Socialists.
Yeah, who did you think I was?
In England. And I was the one that that pissed off our social studies teacher by writing a paper that reviewed Jonathan Schell's Fate of the Earth. I was an anti-nuclear, big anti-nuclear guy. Mm-hmm. These were my issues at the time. I've always been reactionary in that sense of like trying to take on these big issues, and I've always been to the left because my family voted Democrat, and back then that meant you were supporting
the left,
you were supporting the underclass, you were supporting the vulnerable.
At least in your own mind.
At least in your own mind. My mother worked in community mental health, and my father worked in mental health and counseling, a parole officer, and worked for the California prison system, with severely mentally ill patients, who were also incarcerated. Mm-hmm. Right. So that's kind of the values I grew up with, and I've never not had those values.
Right. Well, no, and similarly, we've changed since high school, or actually most of my friends from high school, are like, yeah, I remember that.
I haven't really changed. I just read longer books.
Right. I read shorter books and I have less time.
Well, yeah.
Articles, lots of articles I read.
Listicles.
Because
Yeah.
I can get to the end. God help me.
So let's give do you have anything else you want to say about this book?
Oh, just that I think it's worth reading with the caveat that you've got to close the circle on this. You've got to reach the conclusions that
she's not able to really articulate.
Yeah.
And take it as far as you want to.
Take it as far as you want to. Because I think this is actually critical. And the way you see this play out in social media and in conversations and ad nauseum is how, like, there's some kind of duality between class politics and identity politics.
Mm-hmm.
And there's actually no duality. There's actually no duality. And that you can use these things, and the ruling class has effectively used these things to divide us. And our only response can be to not let them divide us. Even if it seems like the worst thing you could imagine, to make common cause with people across your prejudicial lines.
Right.
It's actually not. The whole point is to divide us along those prejudicial lines. So we can't take on the ruling class, which is relatively small. And
where I'm seeing, I don't want to get too far into this right now, but where I'm seeing that go nuclear now is the centrist left is attacking the left.
Right.
The centrist left being the DNC and... Well,
it's all these PMEs that are like freaking out because their status next to power and their feeding trough is at risk.
You can't say anything nasty about Kamala Harris as the next
sexist,
as the next Democratic candidate, or Cory Booker as the next Democratic candidate, because if you do,
you're just a racist.
If you do, you're threatening. You're already saying, no, I'm not going to fall in line this election either.
Nope.
And like, oh, well, that can't happen. We better put a stop to that. We've got to shut that shit down right away.
How? Well, other than your little shame game, how are you going to do that?
There's nothing.
You're going to like hold a gun to people's heads at the polls?
You could run a candidate that actually excites people.
Oh. Who'd have thunk? But then
That's
you would
class
lose.
warfare.
That's class warfare, and they would lose their place at the table next to the money.
Next to the donors. Yeah.
Well, and not even the donors, but like this is really a class thing. These are the people who are on the line next to the ruling class, and they want to stay there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what's threatened. And it's not polite to say that you are threatening them personally with their status in society.
Well, that was
Which they could lose.
That was the borders strike. Remember?
Right.
Yeah.
So many people were like, "You're threatening my family personally by siding with these workers." I'm like, dude,
you're the one who set up this structure so that you were in opposition to people being able to afford to live where they work
and eat.
Right. All right. Shall we wind it up then?
Yeah, let's wind it up. I think we've talked enough.
We've talked enough. We've talked more than enough.
More than enough.
But I do another. Okay, so we have what you've got some future topics in mind. One of the future topics in mind I have is I want to talk about this circular firing squad on the left now that's opening up because it's just so much fun.
Well, okay, we probably should discuss it. But I actually think it's only good and healthy, because. Oh, and maybe this is cynical. I've heard people describe it as cynical, but
you
for shame. You say that like it's a bad thing,
right? Okay.
But no, the circular firing squad reality is something that happens, and I think it's the only way we can get what we need to move forward. It's like kind of like you gotta burn a field to get those nutrients.
Well, you gotta break the eggs. You gotta break the egg.
You gotta do it.
You gotta hash out the argument, or you don't have any solidarity because you haven't come back around to the things you agree on. But yes, But I was just thinking in terms of you're talking about the class dividing people to stay in power, and that's exactly. It's so stark now. It's stark.
It's naked.
Yeah, and that's actually the great gift of the Trump presidency.
It really is.
Yeah.
And so early. I didn't expect this for another 2 years, but my goodness.
Right. No, it's falling apart fast. Fault lines seams are showing.
And so, people are apoplectic with their, what a nightmare this is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And how can I be joyful in the face of that or not be outraged or shaking with rage? I stopped shaking from rage like 20 years ago.
It's actually, I made my Twitter profile say, who is in fear is never a free man, or something like that.
Yeah.
Like a quote from Horace. It was a very ancient quote.
You are not free if you're living in fear.
Yeah, and that's what I believe is basically that as you stop shaking with rage. I've not interested in any fear mongering.
No, it's pointless.
Because when I see something that's fear mongering, I just so if I because it's always used to control me and manipulate my opinions, and I just shut it down. I just block it out now.
Right. No, and that fear-based campaigning is really about manipulating you.
And that may be another topic that we could get into as to how that works so well on the right and against the working class, because people who have more to lose and less of a defense against the dark arts, you know.
Well,
anyway, all right. I think we're going to wind up then.
Let's do it.
Satisfied?
Next time.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
All right. I didn't talk too much.
That was pretty good.